Thank you everyone for tuning in this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are. We're excited to have EASP advocacy organization comprised of 30 denominations of churches seeking to shift U.S. policy to better support justice and peace throughout the Middle East and support the sustainability of Christianity as well. Also hosted by Embrace the Middle East, working to help vulnerable communities in the Middle East through great development in advocacy work, and the Episcopal Church for conversations with Middle East Christians. And the goal of this series is to really be a conversation. Many of you have been following the issues, various issues. We are Jack Munayer and Sally Azer, Reverend Sally Azer, and they will introduce themselves a little bit more in a moment. But first, let me introduce Chapman. Good evening. I'm told I froze. Hoping I'm back. Can you hear me, Colin?
Yes.
Great. Invite you to post your questions in the post your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat function. That'll make it easiest for us to sort through questions. So we'll have about 40 minutes of dialogue between Colin and Jack and Sally, and then 35 minutes or so for Q&A from you all. So please be thinking of questions and posting them again in the Q&A function, not in the chat. So without further ado, Reverend Colin Chapman has worked for 18 years in the Middle East, where he is taught in seminaries in Cairo, Beirut, Bethlehem. He's ordained in the Anglican Church, and in the UK has taught in Bristol and Birmingham. His book, Whose Promised Land, was written in Beirut during the Civil War and was first published in 1983, the latest revision in 2015. Whose Holy City, Jerusalem and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was published in 2004. He's a celebrated author and respected scholar, and we're very grateful to have him facilitating this series. So Colin, I hand it to you.
Thank you, Kevin. And another thank you to CMEP and Embrace for sponsoring these webinars. So Conversations with Middle East Christians sums up what we're trying to do. We're not going to hear lectures. We're not going to hear a formal presentation. We hope it will be a real conversation. Unfortunately, this technology enables us to see the speakers face to face. And I only wish that they could see the faces of the 200 or 300 people who have signed up for these webinars. I will be asking each of the two respondents to introduce themselves and to tell us something of their own story. Then firstly, I will ask them to describe the general situation in Israel-Palestine as they understand it today. Secondly, I will ask them to describe some of the different ways in which Christians are working to engage with their context and do something very practical. And thirdly, I will ask them how they think we, from outside the situation, can do something to support them in what they're doing. So, as Kevin has said, we'll have around 20 minutes with Jack, 20 minutes with Sally, and then we'll have around 30 minutes for Q&A. So, first of all, Jack, it's over to you, and can I ask you, first of all, to tell us who you are, tell us something of your story, how you come to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you everyone for joining us in conversation today. It's great to see so many people tuning in. My name is Jack. I'm from Jerusalem. I'm half English and I'm half Palestinian Christian with Israeli citizenship, which is a bit to unpack. My family can trace its heritage and its origins in this land to the 12th century, where the first time we're registered in the Greek Orthodox Church is in the 12th century. We hold a very important role, I think, that Palestinian Christians have held for many, many centuries is that we've been the custodians of the land and the holy sites that many of you have probably come and visited or plan on visiting in the future. My great-great-grandfather rebuilt the church where St. George is buried. And this is the same church that my family took refuge in during 1948, during the Nakba, when they were displaced from their homes. So the story of the land, the conflict, and indeed our religious identity are all intertwined. And that's true for me as well. I'm both Anglican and Greek Orthodox. I'm British and Palestinian. I'm involved in human rights, but also very much engaged in church structures. And so this is, I think, the meeting point of many different things. This is a little bit of who I am. At the moment, I'm the coordinator of the EAPI program. It's a program by the World Council of Churches, and it stands for the Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. And I've been coordinating this program for the past 4 years. So, Colin, I think that that's a very short introduction. And indeed, I see that there's some familiar EA names in the chat and in the participant list. So it's good to see you.
Thanks, Jack. That's perfect. So, Jack, the first question is, how do you feel as a Christian Arab Palestinian living in Israel, Palestine today after what's happened in Jenin? How do you understand the general situation, and what does it feel like to be a Christian in the land today?
It's a very big question. I think that we are reaching now the point that we have been warning and expecting and dreading for the past decade. Many Palestinian Christians have been calling out and saying that this is the direction that we're heading, and it's now coming to pass, unfortunately so. Since COVID, the human rights violations, the violence, the challenges that Palestinians, specifically Palestinian Christians, are facing are reaching a turning point, or reaching a sort of the calm before the storm. And I think that Jenin was part of that new phase that we are about to enter, where the levels of violence, displacement of people, and carnage in many cases is what we are expecting to see in this next time to come. In EAPPI, we have tripled the amount of human rights violations that we've documented in less than a year. So both on the level of the state violence, as we've seen in Jenin, but indeed from settler violence, we see increases which are record-breaking for us. We are seeing Palestinian families who are being removed from their homes. There was a family that was removed just less than 2 weeks ago from the old city. And specifically for Christians, this is also very much a turning point. We have seen more attacks, harassment, vandalism of church property, harassment of clergy, and pressure on Christians over the past year, more than we've seen perhaps in the past 10 years combined. There is very much a new approach, a new attitude, and new pressures that Christians are facing at the moment in Jerusalem and in Israel-Palestine more broadly.
Jack, when you talk to visiting congressmen and from the States, political leaders from states and from Europe, do they understand the situation as you can see it?
So a week ago, I led a delegation of senators and members of parliament from Australia. I've engaged with Congress representatives, members of parliament of other countries, and most of them, if not all of them, have a fairly good grasp of the situation. But what they tell me is, you need to speak to my constituents. You need to speak to the churches in my constituency. Because if I ever tried to make a difference, to change things sort of from the mainline political messaging, I'm going to lose my seats. I'm going to lose my position. So we've reached a point where different people in positions of power saying, you don't need to be speaking to us anymore. You need to be speaking more broadly to grassroots movements, churches, NGOs on the ground. And I mean, these are the ones who do speak to me, of course. Those
Yes.
that don't speak might be less aware.
And those people who are at the grassroots, how much progress do they see in what they're trying to do? Do you see any changes in people's attitudes generally?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think the conversation about Palestine and Palestinian rights, and even about Palestinian Christians, has advanced a lot compared to where it was a decade ago, 2 decades ago, where the question was, is there such a thing as a Palestinian people? And I think today, by and large, the majority of mainstream audiences and people don't discuss this question anymore. And the questions have moved more on how to define the situation that we're in, whether it's a conflict, an occupation, an apartheid. And in that sense, the conversation has advanced and has reached new levels. And that's largely due to the grassroots movement and includes organizations like EAPI, Embrace, Churches for Middle East Peace. All of us have contributed to this in one way or another. But on the other hand, the types of pressures that we're seeing at the moment, we're seeing a lot of lip service, but not a lot of changes for people on the ground. So people's living conditions are reaching such a critical point that they're leaving. Certain Palestinian families are leaving their homes because they cannot take it anymore. And this is especially true for Palestinian Christians, who perhaps the biggest threat that we face as a community is Christians leaving Palestine and Israel, and that's, I'm sure, true for other neighboring countries. And so while I think the conversation has progressed, there hasn't been much follow-up and action that has provided support and hope for many people on the ground.
Jack, can we go on then to our next question? And can you tell us something about how Christians are responding to these desperate needs on the ground that you've been describing?
So unfortunately, many Christians are leaving. This is especially true for the younger generation, which don't see a political and economic future for them in the land. They don't see an environment in which they can thrive and prosper. However, those of us that are staying and have decided to stay understand or embrace a very prophetic role that we see in providing a service to our communities and to our neighbors. We believe that we need to be a source of blessing. So if our theology is not a source of blessing to our neighbors, then there's something wrong with our theology. And there's something wrong with our actions. And so we have many Palestinian Christians and Christians more broadly here in Israel, Palestine, that have taken it upon themselves to provide humanitarian services and support for people in need. In my case, my background is in international law and human rights. And so this is the area that I see my contribution being to my community, is reminding the world and each other that we've all signed up to a certain set of principles, and we need to be enforcing these principles, which is basically human rights. And so groups like EAPI, which is a program which is called by the Palestinian heads of churches. So the Palestinian churches have called for this program to be in place, where internationals from all over the world can come and accompany vulnerable Palestinian communities. And this is an act of solidarity. It's inviting people to come and be in relationship with Palestinian communities and churches on the ground. And this is very important. And this is the role that we have as Palestinian Christians, which is we are, in many cases, the bridge between a lot of the international community and the local Palestinian population. The situation that we face under occupation means that this system is meant to isolate people. It isolates Palestinians from Palestinians, Palestinians from Israelis, and Palestinians from the international community. So for us as Palestinian Christians, we see advocacy and type of human rights engagement as a way to resist this unjust system. So this is just one example, but there are many other Palestinian Christian initiatives which are engaging theologically, engaging politically, engaging with community in order to try and bring some light into a very dark place at the moment.
A very specific question, Jack. Does the EAPPI program include people being placed in Israel and working with Jewish communities, or is it and the West Bank?
So EAPPI's mandate is one that's also under international law. It's not only under that of the churches, and so the humanitarian engagement must be in occupied territory, which includes East Jerusalem. However, there is an I in EAPPI, which stands for Israel, and EAPPI is committed to engage with Israeli partners and communities which support a just peace and human rights in the region. And so as a program, we engage with organizations like Rabbis for Human Rights, with Breaking the Silence, and many other organizations which also support this vision of ending the occupation. And there are many Israeli peace groups and activists which we attempt to support and join as they engage with the situation around them.
Are you finding that many Israeli Jews understand what you're trying to do and are supportive of what you're trying to do?
The vast majority of Israeli Jewish society is not aware of the human rights violations and the living conditions and situation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And this is intentional, it's by design. So the majority of Israelis that I speak to, and I speak to a lot of Israelis, are completely unaware and are shocked by the things that I and many others have to share. Israeli Jewish society is going through huge turmoil at the moment. There's protests across all the land, trying to decide and debate the nature and the identity of the state of Israel moving forward. So I mentioned that this is a turning point for us as Palestinians and Palestinian Christians. It's true for Israeli Jewish society as well. So the few Israeli Jews who do engage in peace activism and human rights are aware of the situation, but the vast majority of Israeli society is unaware and largely preoccupied with their own internal discussions.
Jack, do you see any signs of hope in this desperate situation?
The blunt answer is no. I don't see any hope. Not because I don't know, not because there isn't any hope, but I can't see it at the moment. And the reason I can't see it is because the amount of injustice that we see, both in intense, violent incursions like we saw in Jenin, or whether it's the daily grind of simply going through a checkpoint, really cover signs of hope. But as someone who believes that we are called to respond prophetically to this situation, that means that hope has to be part of that package, and hope that there is a higher power that has a plan for my people and has a plan for this land and a plan for the future of humanity. And so I think on paper, in my mind and in my heart, I know that there is hope. but I struggle to see it with my own eyes at the moment. That's not a very positive thing to say, but it's the truth of where I am at this moment.
Thank you for being so honest, Jack. Have you got any people with EAPPI in Jenin or in the area around Jenin?
So we used to have EAs that would be around the Jenin area before COVID, but since COVID took place, there was an absence of programs like EAPPI on the ground, and the impact means that we haven't managed to return to all the areas that we used to work in. But at the moment, it's simply not safe for internationals to be present in a place like Jenin, nor do I believe it would be effective. When you have attack helicopters, when you have drones which are bombing a refugee camp, we are not able to come close to these areas. We are present in many other areas nearby, but certainly not within Jenin or around.
Jack, have we lost you?
Sorry, I must have missed the last question.
Yeah, there wasn't a question. I think everything froze. My last question then would be, Jack, please help us to understand how we can support you and help you.
This is a difficult question to answer because on the one hand, there's 121 people on this webinar, and you all come from your different contexts. You all have different circles of influence. You all have your different capacity to engage and allocate time to the situation here, which is very far from most of you. And so I struggle sometimes to give, a list of solid recommendations. But what I can say is this, is that when our friends and allies and when people who have a genuine interest for a peaceful and just solution in this region, when people turn their attention away from our context, it is to the detriment of our situation. This so-called conflict is not between two peoples. It's not simply between Israelis and Palestinians. It's between Israelis, Palestinians, and the international community, which has in many cases been complicit in many of the things that happen here. So when the attention is turned away from Israel-Palestine, we suffer, and especially the Palestinian Christian community feels more isolated and alone. So I would encourage each person who is taking part in this, and indeed has an interest in the situation here, to engage, whether it's in your church, within your circles of influence at work, and any way where still the problem and the situation in Israel and Palestine continues to be addressed. I happen to believe or engaged with advocacy on a regular basis, and I believe that this is one of the most important things that we can do. And when we have a drop in the levels of advocacy that we see an increase in violence. And I think that there's a direct link between our levels of engagement and how people behave here on the ground. So more than anything, for those that are far away, it is to engage in advocacy. But if and when you do come and visit us, which you are really most welcome, please don't treat us as the Palestinian Christians as another tourist site and another spot on the Via Dolorosa. We are a living part of what goes on here. And we want to be in engagement and in relationship with Christians and others who come from all over the world. And so for those of you that do come and visit, I encourage you to engage, meet, and build relationships with as many different Palestinian Christian bodies, churches, and people.
Thank you, Jack. I'm sure people will have more questions to ask in the later session. So can we go now to Sally and say, Tfaddali, ya Sally, we'd love to hear you. And as before, I would ask you if you would introduce yourself and tell us something about your story and who you are.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be with you all here tonight. My name is Sally Azer. I'm a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and the Holy Land. I am currently in two congregations, the English-speaking congregation in Jerusalem and the Beit Zahor congregation in like the Good Shepherd's Church in Beit Zahor. And yeah, I mean, I've been studying theology the past 8 years, was only ordained since the beginning of January. So I've been only practicing being a pastor since 6 months. I'm not good in math. And yeah, so I've studied first in Lebanon at the New York School of Theology for 4 years, doing my bachelor there, and then did my master's in intercultural theology in Germany, in Göttingen, and practiced for 2 years in seminary in Berlin and Wittenberg. Yeah, so when I returned back, the ordination kind of happened fast, but I've always wanted to study theology when I grew up. It was my passion, and the call kind of got clearer the years that I've been studying abroad. And the love of my country was always there, but I was also always drawn to it. And even when studying theology, I was always thinking of my congregations here and the people and the Christian community as well here, because a lot of us are leaving, and I cannot blame anyone for leaving. But for me also, it was very important for me to come back to town. And yeah, so I'm happy to be back here and
a very practical question. Where do you actually live, and how do you manage to commute between Beit Zahor and the old city?
Well, good question. Well, I live in Jerusalem. I was born and raised there, and commuting, I mean, I go by transportation. I still don't have I don't have a license, which makes it more difficult, I would say, because I do take buses every day from my house to the old city, or from the old city then to the Bethlehem checkpoint, and then I go through the Bethlehem checkpoint, take a cab, and go to Beit Zahor. And that's usually the way that goes. Sometimes I just take a cab from Jerusalem to Beit Zahor because it's just easier, I would say, because it's sometimes frustrating. Like, funny enough, it's not funny, but ever since I moved back to town, I'm getting frustrated even more with the whole situation, and even especially with the checkpoints and everything else. And I know it's not, it's like everyone's telling me, hey, you're gonna get used to it again. But if I'm standing at the checkpoint at 10 p.m. after a youth meeting, and then the checkpoint is closed and there's no way out, and how do you get out? So I was just calling, like, what do you usually do? What's the steps? Like, I'm kind of missing all of that. And it's like not missing all of that, but I'm just like everyone is being so like the normalization of so many things is there that you cannot actually know how or what to what else the people are even used to, and like these days that people don't know what's actually that this is not right to go through it, or they know but they just ignore it. Let's say that.
So Sally, can you tell us first of all then how you understand the general situation in Israel-Palestine at the present time? What does it feel like for you to be living in that situation?
Well, I think the situation didn't change, and I think it just keeps changing in terms of getting worse and worse. And that's how things are being, like, before, like 10 years ago, it wasn't as clear of an of the whole political situation that is there as much as today, with the whole wall and checkpoints that are there, with the whole bureaucracy that is there, with everything going on. It's just like they're putting so much limits, clearer limits to many things, even with the new laws, as I don't know how many of you are following up on the new laws that are coming up from the Knesset and so on, but even like having a Jewish state here in Israel is like a question for us Christians. Where do we as Christians belong in this Jewish state? Because in that space, we don't feel like we're part of any community. Like here, it's the Jewish state where the Christians are not there. And then there's the Islamic state kind of as well that is there. Like it's in both kind of worlds where the Christians are kind of always undermined in that sense. And so it's a question of where are we and what will happen.
Yes. And how do you understand what is going on in the Knesset at the moment and the attempts to change the situation of the courts, for example?
The change of?
The situation, the power of the courts, or the attempts of the Netanyahu government to change the situation of the courts?
Well, mostly I don't see that. Like, I think it's always been there. It's now just being like with the court, like I don't see it changing in any way in any way better for us. Like it's just and in both ways it's more it's just becoming clearer for them as for us, but for us nothing changes in that sense. So it doesn't really matter for us that much.
Are you aware of more and more settlements being built around Bethlehem and Jerusalem?
Yeah, I mean, settlements, I mean, I came back to town and I've seen so much being built, even more. Like you see a whole new Jerusalem, I would say, if you haven't been there since the past 10 years. And settlements are growing and people, and nobody's like, there is not enough being done to stop it. And it's like, and even if like I feel like everyone is losing the hope of having a land by itself again. And I personally, I don't even see it right now to have a fixed land, because what's left of a land right now, what is more important is our human rights that are also not there. And for me, that is the most important thing. Like why can't we have just a human rights so that we can live in a way that is not dehumanizing in that sense?
Yeah. So, Sally, if we go on to our next question, how do you see Christians trying to respond to this difficult situation that you're in at the moment?
It depends which Christians you mean. Like, you mean the Christians in Jerusalem, the Christians in the West Bank? Because I think there is a difference between the Christians living here and there. Because it's not as easy for a lot of people, a lot of Christians living in Jerusalem to speak up against so many things, because there's a lot at stake. And it's nice that we are all saying like we're one, like we have 13 main churches in Jerusalem, and yes, they're meeting up and they're saying, like, putting out statements and doing a lot in order to bring out the word, and they do try to get to many things, but I think these are things that are not working anymore. I mean, we as churches, but we cannot as churches be more like, I don't know, like it's not that we can't, but it's just like there is so much that we have to consider before we say anything. And that's even this whole thing of so many things to consider before even speaking up is just this issue that is there for us Christians. Why should there be? I mean, now the questions for example, our churches or our church in Jerusalem, since the attacks on many churches in the old city, it's just a question of time. When will our church also be vandalized as well? This is the questions that the Christians are raising. It's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of time, when. And so that's why it's kind of not, I feel like this is an issue of itself, and we can talk about it for hours, but in general, I feel like we as Christians are just not, because we're also such small in number, even though with our connections worldwide, we can see how connected we are, how many people are there to support us. And even tonight, these things are very helpful so that the people know what we're going through. And it's then also not only a burden on us, because we cannot keep telling everyone what we're experiencing. And even if we are, nobody would understand it the same way that we do, because it's only until you're there and understand it. I have so many people that I talk to in Germany and from the US and so on, and they didn't like, they were like, only when they came here, and so they were like, oh, okay, now we get what you mean. Because when you talk to them about borders or walls or IDs or something, they have nothing so that they can relate to, which is the right way, not to have something to relate to, but sadly it is there, and it is just not known about.
Sally, the Lutheran Church have many schools in Jerusalem and the West Bank. Are there any development projects? Are there any medical institutions that you're supporting?
Well, mainly from our Lutheran Church is the Augusta Victoria Hospital. So this is from the Lutheran World Federation, and we as a church are very close in cooperation with that, and making sure that a lot of the people are even getting permits and everything to get to the hospital and getting the right treatments that is needed, that is not possible to get anywhere else, and or even trying to get new things so that they can, so that everything is kind of offered to them. So mainly our hospital.
Mm. You mentioned about the different churches that you're relating to in Jerusalem. If I could ask perhaps a difficult question, do you have any relationships at all with Messianic Jews who see themselves as disciples of Jesus the Messiah? Is there any communication at all with these communities of Messianic Jews?
Not really. I think I had an encounter with one or two, but not really close. I mean, I haven't been in town for that long, so I haven't had the chance to be that much involved in all of that. But mostly people from the north who are there, and yeah, but no. So I cannot tell you much more about it.
Sally, tell us about the children's camp that you're running at the moment in Jericho. How many kids do you have? What are you doing with them?
Well, we're about 55. We're a Sunday school camp right now, and we're talking to them on the topic of, the story of Joseph and his brothers. So it's, so we just started today, and it's going on for another 2 days. We're in Jericho because, also why it's in Jericho, because we also don't get permits for all the kids, because this is also another rule that's been changed in my time. We didn't have to get permits for the ones under 16-year-olds. And now we do have to get permits. And that's why it's just a hustle, because if someone doesn't get a permit, what do we do? And so on. So we just decide to stay in the Palestinian territories. And so we are here in Jericho. And the kids are from all the denominations here. I mean, it's fun, and it's exciting to see what they understand from the story of Joseph, to be honest. So it's also interesting, and it's nice to have them to get out of their own spaces too.
Great. Sally, our last question then. Please help us outside your situation. How can we help you? Apart from praying for you, and that's important. What else can we do to help you in your situation?
I think, as also Jack said, it's also a very difficult question, because we get that a lot as well. And I wish I can tell you in what way specifically you can help us, but in one way you can help us sharing more. And even though you think everyone would know, it's not about also knowing, it's also about doing, like maybe offer more people places or things to like where they can support, which organizations can they reach out to, that they can have more an action and reflecting about it in that sense. And of course we cannot stop speaking about Palestine, but I think speaking is not enough, because it's also that you have to come and see as well. And it would be nice to see people here and meet even the Christians here. Even, you know, when they come to, a lot of people come to Palestine or to Jerusalem, and they say we're coming to Israel, and then it's like they think about that Christians there as Israeli Christians, and I'm like, no, I'm not an Israeli Christian, I'm a Palestinian Christian. They exist in Jerusalem as well. Palestine, like Jerusalem, is also there's also a Palestinian part of Jerusalem. It's not all under Israel, but that's of course also a big discussion, kind of. But yeah, it's it would be nice so that people actually know that Jerusalem is not only, but for Israelis, and the Christians are mainly Palestinian here and locally.
For a moment, at least I have, Sally. Sally, I think we lost you for a moment, but
I'm sorry. Now I didn't hear you as well.
I think we lost you for a moment. I
Yes.
interrupted, so please go on. How can we help you?
Yes, I mean, it's mostly pray for us and pray that our situation in that sense moves forward, and come and visit us and speak to us.
Great. Thank you, Sally, very much. So can I hand over to Kevin then, who's going to lead the Q&A session?
Making sure everything is still right here. Thanks so much for that conversation, Colin and Jack and Sally. We've had a few questions in the chat so far, and everyone, this is your reminder to please, I see some chat in the chat. If you want to channel that into a question, we'd love to hear it and hear Jack and Sally's thoughts about that. So the first question I think was aimed at Jack. It's about British popular opinion around Palestine. Jack had mentioned that some Palestinians or some politicians are telling him that it's really the grassroots level that needs to change more than the diplomatic level at this point. And the question is if that's particularly true of the UK. So Jack, I'll leave that to you. Or in Sally, if you have thoughts, of course.
So I've engaged in quite a few advocacy initiatives in the UK, and the UK is one of the most difficult places to talk about Israel-Palestine. Even just talking about things which are not directly related to the conflict, but are Palestinian related, can be very difficult. I've met politicians, clergy, and other public figures that simply stay away from engaging in this topic completely, especially because of the fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. In the UK right now, it's very difficult to say anything about Palestine without being accused of being anti-Semitic. It's true in many other areas as well. And so my experience is that if I'm going to engage with UK public figures, is that we have to approach it very carefully because of how fearful they are. Even if they are aware and agree with a lot of the things that we've been saying today. So that shouldn't discourage us from continuing to engage, but it is my observation that it is incredibly difficult to engage with British public figures on the issue of Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah. Take these questions in order, and again, questions come in. Feel free to pose more. someone else asked about the judicial overhaul and how the massive protests that we're seeing in Israel now might affect the well-being of Palestinian Christians. Do you see, I heard you say you don't see hope, but do you see potential perhaps in these protests to lead to change? And any possibility that some of these protesters, this angst, this energy around change in Israel, those protesters becoming allies for Palestinians? I assume for Palestinians is the question, maybe for Christians, for either of you.
Maybe I can jump in first. So the judicial overhaul is, the first casualties of the judicial overhaul are going to be Palestinians, because it allows the government to execute more harsh measures against the Palestinian population with less legal checks within the Israeli system. Some of you might think that it's already quite bad, but this would certainly make it worse. The Israeli activists that I speak to say that these protests have helped them recruit more young Israelis into talking about peace and the occupation and human rights more than anything else. So I think in certain Israeli Jewish groups or pockets, there is a small awakening to the reality of the situation. I don't know if it's a sign of change, but it is an opportunity. And it seems that some Israeli Jewish peace activists are taking advantage of this opportunity.
Thank you. Sally, would you care to add anything to that? Or I can move to the next question. I know you'll have thoughts on that one.
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yes. The previous question is on whether the protests in Israel regarding the judicial overhaul could lead to change for Palestinians and whether those protesters could become allies from your perspective.
Well, my first thought was no, to be honest, because I mean, it's great to hear, Jack, but at the same time, I feel like this is like all the protests and something are not something that supports us Palestinians, because at the same time, it's just, it's not, like the protests are not helping us, like it's more helping their parliament in that sense. There's no way that this is actually something that gives us more rights or gives us in any way any land or place to be. And I don't know, it's just like not a fight for us, but it's a fight for them. And I feel like these are two totally different things. And I mean, I heard from it also different, like also from a Jewish author. She's also, she also lived here in Israel and then moved back to Sweden. And she was very like convinced that this is the way for helping the Palestinians. And I was like, no, I don't think so. And it was also a big discussion because I think also for a lot of Israelis, it's just not clear. And I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know, but that's more my perspective as well for that.
Thank you. We also had a question about the vandalism against churches. So would either of you care to explain who some of those primary vandalizers are and maybe some of the motives behind that, as far as you know? This is especially in Jerusalem, but really not limited to churches in Jerusalem, as far as I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly radical Jewish people who are so that are coming to like to cemeteries, to churches, and it's specifically aimed to crosses, specifically aimed to the churches as well. And it's been like, I can give you an insight about that. When the Armenian Church was being vandalized, and the ones who were attacking the church, there were boys who, like other men or sort of that, they were stopping them from vandalizing the church, obviously. And then the police came and they took them apart. And guess who was held up longer or who was actually imprisoned in that sense? It was the Palestinians, because obviously after 20 minutes, the police were like, yeah, okay, you're Israelis, you can go. And you're Palestinians, we need to talk to you longer. Yeah. I don't know, Jack, maybe you can comment also on that.
Yeah, I think Sally is highlighting something very important, that the people who are instigating this vandalism come from extremist groups. But the only reason that they're able to do so is because there's no protection for churches and for clergy and Christians, and they are allowed to, unfortunately, behave in this manner and even vandalize inside churches. There was an interesting Israeli news piece that came out 2 weeks ago, where an Israeli journalist put on the robes of a monk and simply walked up and down the streets of the old city. And even Israeli soldiers who patrol the area would spit at him as he was dressed as a Christian monk. And so you have sort of the extreme vandalism, but you also have hostility on a daily basis, which is not isolated simply to the extremists. It includes people who are part of the security forces. And this is only increasing as we've pointed out, and as Sally has given the example of, even when you do call the police, they're not necessarily going to help you. They might do the exact opposite of that.
Thank you. Yes. If I could press you about this one a little bit more, this has been a growing issue, especially in 2023. I think, Jack, you'd maybe have the numbers more, but I'm certainly hearing about it more and more. Maybe it's just being covered more by media, or maybe it's, some have said it's happening more often because of the new radical government of Israel. But I imagine some, Jack mentioned before everyone logged on that he's open to challenging questions or even hostile questions. So I'm going to ask one that might be a little bit hostile, but not intended that way. How do you think about the verse at the end of, in the Beatitudes, where Jesus says, "You and civil about you because of me, for great is your reward in heaven," or "for yours is the kingdom of heaven"? How do you think about that verse as a Palestinian Christian who's lived under persecution for decades? Your whole life, much of your family's history.
It's part of what we expect. It's part of the package of deciding to be a living stone and an active witness to what is going on here, and to say that we are Christians, part of the history and part of the identity of this land, and we won't be intimidated or removed by it. And so some of your question was cut out, but I think you said it's the last verse of the Beatitudes, correct? Seems that Kevin is frozen. But if I understood his question, is that we expect and anticipate to be mocked and to be persecuted because of our faith and because of how our faith calls us to act out.
So sorry, I seem to have frozen and disappeared. Did you finish answering that question? Did anyone pose another yet?
I think I answered your question, and no one has posed another one yet.
Great. Okay. Let me keep us moving forward. A few more questions have come into the. Oh, sorry, Sally. Did you want to respond to that as well? No. Okay. Yeah. Someone has asked. Actually, we have the privilege to have Tim Livesey joining us today. He's the executive director of Embrace the Middle East, and he is asking the question, how is it possible that in a society so connected as Israel, with so much digital communication, how is the widespread ignorance among Israelis possible? Is it willful? What can explain this ignorance about the real situation, especially for Palestinians?
Maybe I can start with this. This is a really good question. So I didn't mention this at the beginning of this talk, but I grew up for most of my life in West Jerusalem, and I attended an Israeli Jewish school. I was the only Palestinian in my year. And as an Israeli, you can go through your life all the way up until your military service without ever speaking to a Palestinian, without ever engaging with media that exposes you to the Palestinian narrative. And even when you are exposed to elements of what happens on the, let's call it Palestinian side, there are very effective mechanisms in justifying or explaining the situation of it. And when I speak to young Israeli teenagers in a variety of different projects, and I tell them my family story, they simply don't believe me. They simply have been taught since a very young age the history that Palestinians are not indigenous to this land, that they weren't kicked out, that they voluntarily left, and all these different things. And it's very, very easy to isolate yourself through your friends, through the mainstream media, and even social media away from Palestinian voices. So Tim and many other people in this call might find that astonishing. But if and when you come and speak to Israelis, you will quickly learn that they have no idea that, for example, Sally and I have two different identity cards, even though we live in the same city. I'm one type of Palestinian and she's another type of Palestinian. And that restricts and limits us or separates us in different ways. Most Israelis aren't aware of this. Most Israelis aren't aware of the impact of settlements. They might know that it's negative for Palestinians, but there's no understanding of how it affects their water consumption, access to land, all these different things. And again, this is not an accident. It's intentionally put there. And it's very, very challenging to find the space where Israelis can start to process a lot of what is actually going on the ground. And this isn't an Israeli thing. This is true for many, many conflicts and many, many other situations around the world where we aren't aware of what our own governments, of how our actions indirectly oppress other people. And so this is why advocacy continues to be such an important point. I see Christopher in the chat has mentioned the US South in the 1950s. That's absolutely true. This is another good example of how a whole community of people can be completely ignorant of what's happening on the other side of town, even though it might be within walking distance.
Thanks. I think sound cut off for me for a moment there. I hope it came through for everyone else. Sally, give you the chance to respond to that as well if you're interested.
Sure. I mean, I'm just I wanted to add to that because it's not only like it's in the schools, it's quite present, and like we never really get into engage. Like I've never had the chance, or not had a chance, but I didn't talk to any Israelis even growing up. I was even surprised when I met an Israeli in Berlin, and I was like, oh no, an Israeli that actually has the same opinion as me, being against the whole things that is going on there, because that doesn't really show. And it's and we live in the same town, we grow up differently, and at the same time it's just it's like we live in a parallel world. But at the same time, I wanted to add, because in the past months or years, you can see the infrastructure is also changing in Jerusalem the way they're building the streets and the way they're building the cities in a way that it's actually making it impossible for having any interactions between a Palestinian neighborhood and Israeli neighborhoods. And there is a major, like where I live, we used to go through a street that's actually just 5 minutes away from the Bethlehem checkpoint, and now we have to take a detour of the 20 minutes, maybe half an hour because of the traffic. But this new street that was created helps the settlement or the settlers to travel more comfortably from their homes to the old city directly without stopping. And that's why it doesn't matter where we Palestinians live, or if we have to go, or if our work, or if we want to go to Bethlehem and so on, they're just making it harder on us to move around and go there. And it's just impressive to see that happening in the past months, to see how much change and how much they're adding to our daily lives. These are like basic things, and it's not even, and we're not even able to move around freely in that sense, even in Jerusalem.
Thank you. I think we can do one more political question and then hopefully a couple ones on churches. So someone has asked, is it true, as this person has heard, that most Palestinians now support a one-state solution instead of a two-state solution?
I mean, to be honest, the churches are still saying we want a two-state solution. That's what the churches are aiming for, and that's what they hope for, or they're working for. But if we're realistic, it's just, let's say, it's not as clear as it was before, and I don't know if that will change in the next years. But for now, they're still at the two-state solution.
I'm very skeptical of comments about what Palestinians think about solutions, because it's a little bit like fantasy football. It's talking about something that's so distant from reality. The majority of Palestinians that I speak to, and I'm sure that Sally speaks to as well, don't talk about solutions. They don't talk about one state, two state. They talk about survival. This is the main focus. It's not about, what we would like ideally. I mean, yes, we can come up with maybe some type of vague ideological position, but I think the more common and honest conversation is surviving in this land, not necessarily what solution would be most ideal for me moving forward. And that's especially true for people coming from lower socioeconomic standards, people who are more vulnerable to state violence. There's not really much discussion about one state or two states in these circles.
Thank you. Earlier in the evening, someone transitioned a little bit more to the church side. We've talked, each of you shared a little bit about what it is churches or Christians in the West, broadly speaking, can do to help. What are some things that churches should stop doing? See some grins. Go ahead, let us have it.
Well, churches here or around the world?
Particularly, I would say in the UK and the US.
Well, maybe stop giving money. To that. Well, I think I just saw it as well in the chats. I think a lot of you know that there's a lot being given also to the Israeli state, and I think if the churches are actually not giving their amount of money that supports that, would help in one way. And also just share more I think also the whole topic of anti-Semitism and even Palestinian Christians, because I think a lot of people just confuse that with each other in a lot of way and makes things even more complicated when talking about anti-Semitism and talking about Christians there. And I think it's just, we shouldn't mix that, and it's should be more aware of it.
I'm going to make an assumption that most people on this call don't belong to a Christian Zionist church or organization, or at least have space to voice their disagreement within the church, or else the messages we'd be getting in the chat might be slightly different. I think that you can be someone who supports Palestinian causes but still cause harm. So I think it's important for churches and individuals who have good intentions not to enforce colonial frameworks, to be aware of power dynamics, dependency that could be in the long run or indirectly harming Palestinians. And I think many Palestinians, and especially Palestinian Christians, were so desperate to be in relationship and be engaging with brothers and sisters around the world that were willing to take negative behaviors, privileged behaviors, just to be in relationship. And so I think when you're about to engage on any activity or advocacy or anything that is related to Israel-Palestine, it's worth saying, you know, could I be causing harm with my actions indirectly? Is this something that enforces a power dynamic of privilege when I engage in this? And so I think that that's also something that's important to keep in mind.
Evan, I wonder if I can interrupt to ask a question of Sally and Jack. Several people in the UK have pointed out the enormous difference between the way the West has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its violation of international law, and the way the West responds to all that has been happening in Israel-Palestine. I have also read that the Israeli government seems to be trying to ride two horses at the same time. It seems to be wanting to keep its lines of communication open with Russia for reasons related to Syria. And it has not been willing to send any weapons to Ukraine. Have you any reflections about how the Israeli-Palestinian situation is related to Ukraine?
Well, I wouldn't say directly it's related to Ukraine, but it's impressive to see how many people are just easily speaking up about that situation and pointing out that the things that are going on there is just not right and so on. But when it comes to Palestine and Israel, it doesn't happen. So it seems to be a bit sad to see how much the world looked to that and spoke up to that. And here we're living it since, I don't know, more than 70 years. And it's just like everyone freezes when it comes to it. So I think it's more related to that. And I mean, I think in the Middle East in general, it's a bit of, when we look at the churches, it was also a bit of a struggle with the Russians and the Russian churches and the Orthodox churches and their relation and so on. And this is also one big struggle. Like, I think it's, yeah, it's just complicated.
It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think before we talk about the West's response, we have to talk about the West's responsibility. And the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan could be held to a similar light. So I think that already in your question, Colin, there's an assumption that the West is in any position to be, the one deciding how to respond ethically to one situation over another. But simply speaking, there's a lot of interests for Western states in maintaining the status quo in the Middle East, whether that's in Israel-Palestine or whether that's in other locations around us. And so it would require a lot of very serious accountability and soul searching, I think, before there could be any form of arbitration on moral grounds when it comes to, the West is, but Sally is of course correct in saying that at least for people on the ground, and maybe not for governments, there's a clear hypocrisy and double standard when it comes to the so-called civilized people, and then us, who are the so-called uncivilized people.
I think that will be our last question for the evening. Someone else asked about trips, ethical trips that go to the region, and I'll just remind you that if you're coming from the UK, Embrace the Middle East supports trips to the regions and encourage you to be in touch with them. If you're coming from the US, Churches for Middle East Peace arranges trips as well. I encourage you to be in touch with us. You can be in touch with Jack or Sally or any of us on this call about other means of, and give us a closing word.
Sorry, Kevin, I didn't hear all that. Are you handing over to me?
I'm handing it to you.
Yes, sure, thanks.
Yeah.
I just want to say a very big thank you to Jack and to Sally. You're both extremely busy in your different activities, and it's probably late at night. And I really appreciate the honesty with which you have spoken. And I particularly won't forget Jack saying that he sees very little hope in the situation. And I think that's how many of us who have taken part in this session this evening feel. We feel a lack of hope, but our faith urges us to continue to hope. One final reflection, I think, is that in responding to all these issues, I think we need, on the one hand, to try to understand the big picture. And on the other hand, we need to understand the details and every individual situation where people are working. It was my experience of visiting the land many decades ago and living through the civil war in Lebanon that forced me to try and understand what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was all about. And I had to try and understand the history and all the different stages of the conflict. And as I've tried to follow the conflict over the years, it's become more and more complicated. Next week, we'll be talking to people from Iraq. And when we in the West talk with people in Iraq, we will have this deep sense of guilt and shame over all that the West has done to contribute to the problems that they find themselves in today. So on the one hand, all of us, I think, need to try and understand the history of and what is going on at the moment to understand the big picture. Recently, I watched a video of Jeff Halper of ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And he was absolutely brilliant in trying to help us to understand what the movement of Zionism as a settler colonial movement has been trying to do for decades. So on the one hand, I think if we're struggling to support you, we need to try our best to understand the big picture. But at the same time, we need to support particular projects and particular people. I'm so glad that we've seen Jack and Sally on the screen. So I hope we will remember your faces, and I really hope that we will continue to pray for you and pray for the different works in which you're involved, in the Lutheran Church and EAPPI. And there are a host of other organizations that CMEP and Embrace are in touch with. So there is no limit to the ways in which we can support in very, very practical ways. So my last word really is about trying to understand the big picture and being very specific in supporting people and situations. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And thank you, Jack and Sally, for your clearly very beloved honesty, frankness, and candor in the evening conversation. I hope to see all of you back for the rest of our series next week on Monday, same time, same place, on Christian in Iraq. And then we'll have a week off, and the following 2 Mondays on Christianity in Egypt and Lebanon. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to being in touch.